Okay, just as a audio test, if you can hear me, can you give it a thumbs up underneath the video just to confirm? Okay, just as a audio test, if you Okay, let's check the audio again. Okay, I think that's better. Okay, let's check the audio again. Well, welcome. And make sure I've got all my audio working the way it's supposed to. Okay, I think that's good. Not everybody will probably be able to chat. If you can, put something in it. If you can hear, or put a thumbs up underneath the video. I'm trying something a little bit different here today. Two things that are different. We are broadcasting just on YouTube. I wanted to give that a try and just see what would happen if we went straight through YouTube without WebEx. If you have an opinion on whether that's better or worse, please send me an email. Let me know. Downside is I'm not sure as many people will be able to participate in the chat, but we're going to give it a try anyway. The other thing we're doing is this is actually the talk I gave on Tuesday, but I gave it at over the lunch hour for Central Time. And I know there were some people that were interested in coming that were in Eastern time and didn't have the 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock hour open. So we're giving the talk again at the lunch over the lunch hour for people that are in Eastern time zone. So also, if that's like a great thing for you and that makes things a lot better, let me know so we can maybe do some more things like this. So today we're going to be talking about crafting compelling stories, a key to successful software. And I just realized I have a problem here. This remote I use for this is what it's got a laser pointer, and my daughter uses it to let the dog run around. So I have a dog looking very expectantly at me right here, just waiting for me to let her chase the laser pointer. Shh, 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 shh. You stay there. Okay. Anyway, that's a different. Okay, this is today. Coming up next week on the 11th, we're going to be talking about the difference between projects and products. I had a conversation with someone yesterday about this, and it made me realize that that's not something that we've really talked about, like really gone through. We've talked around it a lot, but I thought that might be an interesting thing to just really kind of dig into. What's the difference between a project and a product, and why is the differentiation important? And what does it mean for a team or even for an organization to kind of have those different mindsets? So that's coming up next week on Tuesday. And then on the 18th, we're going to talk about agile aligned organizations. No, agile aligned organizations. So talking about, so agile was designed for teams, but an organization can work in a way to completely not take advantage of a bunch of agile teams. Organizations can also work in ways that take advantage of agile teams. In addition to that, organizations can actually have agility in the way that they work at an organizational level, in addition to at a team level. So those are some things that are coming up. Hope you can join us for some of those. Okay, so question for you right here. What word best describes your role on the team? I put the link in the chat. Let me put it here one more time. And you should be able to type it in. You can also go to the QR code or just type in that URL that shows up there, the polev.com/markshed434. Let's see. So we've got several things on there. Background, yes. I think some people were answering that they could hear me, so that's a good thing. Music timer, OCM, a strategist. It looks like some people are Scrum Master, senior Scrum Master. Okay, so we've got a lot of people. I don't see any developers, so it looks like most of us are coming to this from the kind of the PM and the Scrum Master space. At least people that put things in the filled this out. Okay, there we go. Oh, tester. Okay, good. We got some testers here. There we go. Okay, it's catching up. I think there's a slight delay here for me, so that might explain why it takes me just a minute to see it. Okay, strategist, Scrum Master. Look, master is the biggest word there, so it sounds like we've probably got a lot of Scrum Masters here. Analysts. I see IT advisor. Okay, cool. So we've got kind of a wide range of people here. It looks like most of us are kind of in the project management space for stuff. So I think this will be very relevant regardless of what background you're coming from. Oh, and just mention one thing, although you have found it, this is the Agile L&L YouTube channel where we kind of archive all of our talks and also where we stream things live. If you haven't subscribed to that and like to subscribe to things on YouTube, this might be worth subscribing to. It also might be worth bookmarking if you ever have something, hey, I want to find out about behavior-driven development or test-driven development or something like that. I think we've got maybe actually I think we may even be up to 200 recordings here, so sometimes that can be useful. We have a lot of guests that come in and talk about different things in addition to me, so this might be a good resource to have bookmarked if there's ever something you're looking for. Okay, so let's talk about user stories. So a user story represents work. So question for you, what describes your feeling about using user stories? So A would be it's a silly way to say requirements. B, it's a very useful way to capture high-level details of real user needs. C would be it's too little information to really be useful. D, it doesn't represent much of what the user really wants. Or E, love and adoration for user stories. Or F, loathing and hate for user stories. These are all responses I have seen people have to user stories. So there's not a right or wrong answer here. The question is just, how do you feel about the user stories? When you hear user stories, what do you think of it? And I see some people here saying that it's a very useful way to capture high level details. D usually doesn't represent much of what the user actually wants, and that can be true. We'll talk about that a little bit and why that might actually not always be a bad thing as long as we've got the gist of what they're wanting. What else? What else do people feel about and any other feelings? And if you leave that tab open, we've got some other things that we'll do as we go through here. So it sounds like most of us. I did this one time, and most people were very much against it. They just thought user stories were stupid and a complete waste of time. So it sounds like we've got a spread, but not all of us are completely on it. Okay, we got at least one person says, or at least a few people say it's a silly way to say requirements. I'm going to suggest that user stories may actually be significantly different than requirements, and they may be part of it. But if we think of user stories as requirements, it may lead us to a different place than if we think of it just as a placeholder that allows us to prioritize the value that this thing represents. We can have a user story for something and decide whether or not we're going to do it well before we actually know what the requirements are or the details of how we do it. So we'll talk about that in just a second. Okay, I'm going to switch over. This will stay up. If you have questions, you can fill them out here. If you think of something, I'll try to address them at the end so that I'll keep popping back to this. So if you think of something, feel free to drop it in there. Okay, a user story is something that starts out as fiction, right? We call it a story. So it describes a world that does not exist yet. If you're writing user stories for things that your system already does, I'm not really sure what the value would be there, but the general idea of a user story, it's a short work of fiction that describes a possible change that would hopefully be beneficial to your user. So if we think of stories, so here's an example of stories. So these are great stories. We've got some great comic books. So these are stories, but these are really long. If your user stories are as long as a comic book, that's probably not a good sign. It probably means you're putting a way more effort into stuff before you've actually even been able to determine whether it's actually valuable for someone or not. So maybe we should think more of just a comic strip. Okay, so here's a comic strip with this Tracy. I'm not even sure what's going on in this, other than the guy says his house is sliding into the lake. So this is shorter. Maybe that's more closely represented to a user story. But when I look at this, it doesn't really tell me a complete story, right? It's part of something bigger, but it doesn't really exist independently. At least this particular comic strip. Um, but when I think of good user stories, I actually think of the Far Side. So here we've got a genie appears on a desert island to this guy that's stranded there, and he says, "Well, let's see. So far, I've got rhythm, I've got music. Actually, who could ask for anything more?" There's a huge amount of information conveyed in this. It's a complete story in and of itself, and it's just got a few. It was even one sentence, two sentences, and maybe even incomplete sentences of text, and a picture. But it's very complete in and of itself. You don't have to know a bunch of other things for it. We've got a complete story just with this. This other one, which I like even better, we've got a complete story, and there's no words actually underneath it. You've got a few words, I guess, showing up in there, but this is a complete story. You kind of see what's going to happen. It tells a complete story. And what I want to kind of suggest here is we want to be thinking of user stories as having this type of completeness in them. Now, user stories usually represent three things. We want user stories to represent the who, the what, and the why. Who are we doing this for? And it should be a user or somebody that's actually using the system. What are we going to do? Like, what is the change? What is the description of the world, how the world will be different for that person? And then why is, how are we justifying doing this? What's the reason behind this? Well, what's the reason that the who, the person, would actually want the what? So the why tells us why, the who would want the what. And this is a very important line, because if we leave this line out, we get ourselves in all kinds of trouble of doing all kinds of things that we don't understand. And when developers are working on stuff and we don't give them information about why they're doing it, it's very easy for them to blindly follow exactly what they were asked for and produce something that no one actually wants because they didn't understand what it was, the value it was actually meant to provide. It also, if you leave out the why, it deprives the developers of being able to engage and maybe suggest other alternatives. If you're asking for something and you're saying this is why we need to do it, the developers may know a way to accomplish that without actually writing any code. I sat down one time with a group or a small business with their CEO and their chief operating officer, and we went through and they were describing to me the system they wanted me to build for them. And they were explaining what they wanted to do and why they wanted it. And as we went through everything, I had gotten the whiteboard and written all this stuff out. And we got to the end and I looked at it and I said, you know what? We've just created a diagram of the calendar component of Microsoft Exchange. And you have Microsoft Exchange and you use it today. And the CEO looked at the COO and said, "What? We've got Exchange?" And he said, "Yeah, that's what you've been sending emails on in your calendar." So we were able to prevent probably something that would have cost them $50 to $100,000 to build. They actually had, but by defining what they wanted to do and why they wanted to do it, we were able to save them lots of money on that particular thing because they already had it. And oftentimes there's situations where your software either can do things already that where your software can do things that maybe people don't know about, or there's a way to do it that maybe the users don't know about. And if we fill out these three things, we can have those conversations in a way that makes the development a lot more efficient because we're actually bringing all the power of the users and the scrum master and the business and the developers all together around here's what we're trying to do. And sometimes we can even find ways to not do it. Now, one other thing that I think a lot of times people like to add to user stories is the how. And I'm going to suggest that we probably don't want to have the how on the user story. Um, Having ideas like in notes of this might be a way we could implement this might be fine. But if we implement the how, we've probably solved a lot of the problem that's represented there already. And the how usually is more efficient to leave until we actually start working on the story. Because it's very easy to say, here's the who, the what, and the why, and then prioritize that against all the other things we could be working on. If it's lower in the priority list, any effort we put into the how is probably going to be a waste. Because we could have taken that time that we went into digging into the details of how we were going to do it, and we could apply that to delivering something else that's higher up in the list of priorities. So that's not to say we should never have any idea of how we're going to implement something, but I've seen some stories that have it's got the who, the what, and the why, and then they put the how in it, and they've basically done all the programming work and put it into a note telling someone to go into this database and make this particular change and do this and this and this. And it's done a lot of work that could have been spent on something else that they've actually identified as a higher priority. Or if you are doing that work, it might have been better off just to go ahead and do the work instead of trying to write it all up to tell someone what to do. So a lot of times you'll find user stories using something like this. So this is a template. There's nothing special about this template. You can use anything you want, but what this does is it makes sure we have it says who this is for, what they're trying to what they want to do, and then why they want to do it. So this is the who, the what, and the why. Using these templates there's a couple reasons that you may want to stick with the template. One would be it kind of prevents writer's block, right? If you have something like this, it's easy to see, oh, I'm in here and I just need to fill this out. The other thing it does is it can make it consistent across lots of stories. On the other hand, if you get into trying to fill something like this out, a third reason it can be useful is it can help us keep them short. By having a template, it often kind of forces us to let's find the best way to say this as concisely as possible that tells everything we need to tell, but doesn't become overly verbose. On the other hand, if you're trying to make this work and it doesn't work for the story that you're trying to tell, and you don't feel like you can change it, you should question how much agility your team actually has if you can't change something as simple as just the template you're using for your story. So this can be a good place to start. You should be very flexible in what you do as long as you're keeping things short and very focused on what you're trying to accomplish. So here's a user story. As a toddler, I want a way to trigger Baby Shark so I can play it on my own. Okay, now notice we've got the who. This is a toddler that wants to experience this. What they want to do, they want to hear Baby Shark. Or they want a way to trigger Baby Shark. And why do they want to do this? Because they don't want to have to ask someone else for help when they want to. They don't want to be dependent on someone else to trigger Baby Shark. Now, when I wrote this the first time, when I was preparing for this talk, I realized that I had actually included part of the how in the what. And I said, I want a button to start Baby Shark. And I realized that I was presupposing here is how the toddler is going to interact with it. And I was including, and my point here in telling you this is that it was very easy for the how to creep into the what. But it would be better to leave that out until we actually get together and start working on the story, because we may predispose everyone to a particular solution, when if we talk about it, we may come up with something better than any of us would come up on our own. Maybe this toddler, it would be better if they clap their hands 3 times and it would play Baby Shark, or they would say something that would trigger it, or giving them a button on the screen, they can't touch that, so we need to just give them a big sensor plate on the ground that whenever they stand here, it plays Baby Shark, or whatever it could be. But I did want to point out that even in just writing this example, I started putting in how into this story when it would be better to leave it out. So the how, what we want the how to tell us is, how will the world be better? So let's look at some examples, some silly examples of that. So this is a picture of a cow, and the cow is saying, as a cow, I want to be milked, so I will be comfortable. This is actually my grandfather, a picture of my grandfather and his family cow, and I think one of my mom's cousins in Washington State. They had a cow that they kept for the family. That's where they got their milk. Anyway, this cow wanted to be comfortable. It might have a story like this, saying, as a cow, I want to be milked, so I will be comfortable. And a similar thing from the standpoint of this farmer, we may have 2 stories that are kind of representing moving toward a similar goal. As a dairy farmer, I want cows milked on demand so I can maximize production. Well, these 2 stories are very aligned. That's what the cow wants. Anytime its son starts getting comfortable, it can go get milked. Anytime, and the farmer wants to make it as easy as possible for the cows to get milked so they can maximize his milk production. If you notice, I grew up on a farm and live in a very rural area, so my examples sometimes tend toward that. Now notice, this is what the farmer wants. I want cows milked on demand, and here's why he wants it. He wants to maximize production. But notice, we don't say how we're going to achieve this. That's being left to be determined. We can put this in JIRA or whatever our system is, have it there, and when this becomes the next most important thing to work on, we can find the way that we want to achieve this. We may even have multiple steps to achieve it. We may discover, hey, we'll take this step right now because this helps, this gets us a short-term thing, but long-term it'll be more efficient to do something else. So like an example might be, the farmer could say, okay, I'm going to staff the barn 24/7. There's going to be people there. Whenever a cow walks in, we'll just milk it. The expenses are going to go up for our payroll, but maybe they decide it's worth it. They could also say, okay, the farmer could also say, okay, that's expensive to staff it 24/7. I'm going to put a buzzer in whenever a cow comes into the barn and walks up to the milking stand or milking corral. I did not grow up on a dairy farm, so I don't know all the terms for that. But when they get in there, it pages him, and then he can get up in the middle of the night and go milk the cow whenever they need to be milked. So that's another potential solution that they might decide to do. And these are things that could probably be implemented, fairly quickly. I have some friends that actually do run a dairy farm, and this is what they put in. They put in 2 or 3 of these machines. So this is a laser guided device that when the cow comes in, it figures out what cow it is. It feeds the cow what it needs, gives it any medication it needs, logs that it's there. This device over here on kind of the robotic arm will clean the cow and use laser sensors or laser rangefinders, I guess, to figure out exactly where the udders are and attach it and milk the cow, keep track of how much milk it had so they can keep track of if the cow doesn't seem like it's healthy or something. I mean, there's lots of stuff that goes. This was not as simple as just saying we're going to have a buzzer or we're going to staff the farm 24/7. But this is a fascinating piece of, a very, and my point here is there's lots of different ways we could actually satisfy what the farmer is asking for here. This may be what he wants to get to eventually, but maybe we take steps as we go. So we may have a user story that we fulfill in different ways over time as the product matures. So stories that support our principles or our agile principles are going to foster good development, but bad stories are going to hinder the development process. So if we have stories that are written poorly, that would mean that they're written in ways that push us away from the agile principles. So push us away from having working software in the hand of the users as being our measurement of progress. So user stories are fiction, and they're written from the user's point of view. They're describing how somebody interacts with the software, how they're going to actually get something out of using the software. And that means that progress means the user can do something new that makes them happy. If you're delivering a story that does not make somebody that uses the system happy, it's probably not a good story. So waste is going to be stories with no return on investment for the user. So if we're delivering things that are being sliced or delivered in ways that the user doesn't actually benefit from and the user can't see as progress, like actually experience as progress, that is going to introduce waste into our process. So here's a story. As a developer, I want a CI/CD pipeline so I can deploy to the cloud. So keep that story in mind. I want a CI/CD pipeline so I can deploy to the cloud. And click on how does this story make you feel? Does this story make you feel happy? And keep in mind, the idea of a CI/CD pipeline is a great thing, but does this story, the way it's written, actually feel good about from what we've talked about stories? Does this feel like a good story that you're like, yes, I see how the user will see this as a benefit? So, how does this story make you feel? So, a couple things we might think about on this story. So, it looks like no one's saying that this is just okay. We got one person saying this just makes them feel great. Keep in mind, where we're going to go with this is I'm going to suggest that this may not be the best story, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a CI/CD pipeline. But I wanted to suggest a different way of approaching this that will drive things from the user's perspective. Because when I see a story like this, I don't see that there's anything in here that I'm probably going to be able to, that's going to make the user's life better. So, Sue, that logs into our application every Monday morning and spends most of her time in our application, is probably not going to come in Monday morning and say, "Oh wow, I've got a CI/CD pipeline. This is so great. I've always wanted one of these." Right? They're probably not going to experience that. On another project, Bob, who's the user that's really looking forward to the project, the software we're trying to make for him. If we tell him, "Hey, look, we've got a CI/CD pipeline in place now," he's going to say, "Okay, yeah, when can I start actually seeing some of this new thing that you're building for me that's going to make my life easier?" So I would actually suggest that this is not going to be a great story. We probably want to steer away from stories like this because it's not actually written from the standpoint of the user. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad to build a pipeline. We definitely want these things, right? These are really, really good things, but we might not want to write our stories from this perspective. So it's not bad to build a pipeline. But one of the problems is if we treat this pipeline as progress, it's going to push us away from the idea of working software being progress with the idea that working software is things that the users can actually use. And if we get away from that, we lose these guardrails that help keep us laser focused on exactly what the user needs. So this story, how could we change this story to get something that gives us feedback to the users sooner? And here's a suggestion. As a user, I want to see the logo so that I know I'm on the right site. Okay, if we've actually got constraints that say we're not allowed to go in and manually deploy stuff, and a lot of places have those constraints, and if you don't have them, you can obviously make such a constraint. But this story would actually require building out some of the CI/CD pipeline. We may not need all of the pipeline to do this, but we will need quite a bit. This story, as simple as it sounds, might take us quite a bit of time because the security that goes into it and different things like that. This will also prove that the CI/CD pipeline is capable of deploying the application. And I know that sounds like a given, but I've worked with places that have spent so much time trying to build out their CI/CD pipeline that they deferred even a simple story like this until way, way late in the process. And once they got ready to actually start building the application on top of the CI/CD pipeline they had built, they discovered that the pipeline really wasn't fit for purpose. It did a bunch of things they didn't need at that point in time, and there were a bunch of things that they did need that it didn't do, and there were a bunch of things that they needed to change and tweak that were really, really, really hard to change. So this story helps alleviate a lot of that type of risk because it says we're going to start with something that we actually need to do. We need to be able to deploy the simplest site possible, which in this case, just saying we're going to put a logo on the site. And we're going to use that to actually drive out the technical details that we need to have happen. So why do software projects fail? Well, they fail because they fail to deliver working software. If we build things from the user's perspective, we lower that risk significantly. And sometimes I've seen people say, well, then you just take shortcuts for everything. You have to do this intelligently, right? If we want to say we need everything to be scripted, all of our deploys to be scripted and deploy themselves and within automation, then that just becomes part of your definition of done. Oftentimes, the things that we need from technical stories can be part of our definition of done and just get built out with every user story, every incremental step of the user story. So, if we're building from the user's perspective, we need to think about how does the user think about the software. Um, so let's say that I'm going to, just as an analogy, I live down in Fort Scott. Kansas City is about an hour and a half away. I might want a story if I needed to travel back and forth between there. I might want a story that says, as a driver of a car, I want trees cleared from Fort Scott to Kansas City so we can level it. Well, this is probably kind of a technical story, right? Because as a driver of a car, simply moving all the trees does not give me the capability to go to Kansas City. The why, so we can level it, is also a technical story because that's telling me that's just setting me up for the next thing I want to do, which is be able to put down, start building bridges or whatever. So if we oftentimes we have technical stories that are kind of like this. Matter of fact, it probably even instead of as a driver of a car, we might say as a civil engineer, I want trees cleared from Fort Scott to Kansas City so we can level it. Well, that's a technical story, and that's probably not how we want to approach building software. So we might try something like this. We might say, okay, Fort Scott to Kansas City is a long ways. Let's try to make it to Pleasanton. So Pleasanton's somewhere down here, right? So not nearly as far. And as a driver of a car, I want a highway from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can drive back and forth. Well, that might be a little bit better. Maybe we can deliver this sooner. This actually gives me something as the driver of a car, but this is probably going to be a multi-year project to try to do something like that. Maybe a very, very long time. There's lots of stuff that would go into actually doing this. So if we're looking for a way to split it down even more, we might start saying, well, what would actually represent progress to the user? What is the user trying to accomplish here? Well, the user is trying to get from Fort Scott to these other places, to Pleasanton and to Kansas City, and maybe a bunch of places in between there. That's the goal, is to be able to actually get from one place to another. So we could write a story like this and say, as a driver of a 4x4, now notice I've restricted it. It's not for all cars. We're just looking at 4x4s that can handle rougher roads. I want a trail from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can travel in good weather. We've now made this a lot smaller, right? This is a lot smaller. And we might say, okay, so we might end up with something like this, right? It's not quite that pretty between Fort Scott and Pleasanton, but you get the idea, right? This isn't an all-purpose road, but we're just trying to start out by saying, let's get to Pleasanton and see if that's actually a good thing. So once we get that, and we're going back and forth, so if we deliver a story like that, it's been focused on the user. So people with 4x4s can actually use this now. Now, the person that's with a Prius probably isn't going to be able to drive down this road, but we can go back and forth. We might come back with another story and say, okay, as a driver of a car, I want a gravel road from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can drive back and forth. So now we can do it with a car. It's not a it's not the highway we want. We maybe can't go as fast. If the weather's really bad, maybe we can't go. It gets potholes and some things more often than maybe the highway would give us. But we're now able to navigate. More people can actually make use of this. So then we might come up with something saying, okay, as a driver of a car, I want a paved road from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can drive back and forth at higher speeds. And then maybe we get something like that. Or we may decide, you know what, we've got a gravel road to Pleasanton. Let's go ahead and make a trail from Fort Scott all the way to Kansas City or to the next town so I can drive back and forth in good weather. And now we've got a trail going through the rest of that. So a story like this could be the next incremental thing. But if you notice, I'm always trying to make these stories in a way that delivers something to the user. Somebody can actually use this for something. And I know we're using this isn't your software, right? But this type of approach is very, very powerful in software. Now, a lot of times what pushes us to not deliver like this is that we have this idea that we don't want to redo anything, right? If I put in a trail and it has to go kind of around this, it's got to go around the river, but I really want a highway that's actually going to go over the river, or go to a ford in the river or someplace. I really want to go and cross here eventually. Maybe I feel like it's a bad thing and I'll have to rework stuff. Because we wanted a highway, didn't we? That's what we wanted. Why would we do these things that we're going to have to, abandon the trail later? And if you're driving around the road, you see this, right? You see a gravel road over there that used to be there. Maybe it's not even there anymore. And then there's an old highway here that's now blocked off and they're using it to store hay or something. And then you're on the new and improved highway. But what if we change our mind once we've been there? So let's say we try to go to we get a trail all the way to Kansas City, And then we get there by 4x4s, and it's a rough long ride to get there. It takes, doesn't take an hour and a half, takes a lot longer. And then we decide on second thought, let's not build a highway to hit Kansas City. Tis a silly place, right? We're not going to go there. We've actually experienced it now. We've done what we wanted to accomplish, which was the travel between these 2 points. And it turns out that's not what we want to do. Let's go to Wichita instead, or somewhere else. And this is really important because lots of times money is invested in software that turns out not to do what is needed. And despite our best planning and the talking to people and creating requirements, it's very easy to create software that turns out not to, it may be even exactly what the user asked for, but once they try to use it, it's not at all what they want. Like another silly example of this, what if we build a highway to Kansas City and then discover the city's been taken over by zombies? Well, it may have been a lot better to have a trail that we can kind of destroy instead of this nice way for them to walk all the way down to Fort Scott. Um, but my point is that if we're giving people things incrementally, and this is what user stories actually should help facilitate, is giving users things incrementally so you can get feedback on this next piece you've given them in order to make the next piece the right thing that we could work on next. Our priority should constantly be being driven by, we gave the users one thing, they were able to use it, and then they told us this is the next most important thing to them. Software, from a developer standpoint, is built like this, right? We've got the user interface, stuff where the candles are and stuff. We've got the business logic, we've got the database, and we've got the hardware at the bottom. So it's very easy to approach this from the standpoint of this is how it's developed. But I want this slice right here said no one ever, right? That's not, users don't come and ask you, I need a database for my application, and then we'll build the business logic on top of it. Now, if you got a kid who only eats frosting, they may be fine with slices like this, but maybe that's where our analogy breaks down. What users think of is the part of the application that lets them do something. If this is an accounting application, maybe this part right here is the piece that lets them write checks. And that part over there is the part that lets them do reports at the end of the year for their taxes. They think of things that are slices all the way through the application. And that's really important because to build this for them, we're going to need to give them something with hardware, something with the database, something with the business logic, and something with the user interface. And stories will usually need to touch all or many of those things in order to actually deliver something that represents progress to the user. Now, we often think in terms of, well, you can't build a house without building a foundation, and that is much more true for houses than it is for software. Although, if you've looked at houses that have been invested in over centuries, you'll discover that they may have built a foundation in one place that doesn't represent the foundation of everything the house eventually grew to. Now, it's on a much larger time scale, but a lot of times you start out with a house that looks one way, and then as needs are discovered or the family grows, they add a foundation and build somewhere else. There's a house here in Fort Scott that, and I've seen this happen in other places too, where they built the house and their family grew. And so they said, okay, we need to actually have a bigger house. They jacked the house up and built another story underneath it. They did not need that extra story when they started, but it was responding to change, which sounds an awful lot like what we want to do with having agility in our software development. So these represent the kind of story I told here of the different ways of building a road or growing a road, we'll call it that, can be a useful thing to just keep in mind when you're thinking of your software. Are you doing things that actually facilitate what we're trying to do, which is get between 2 points? Are we giving the users the ability to get the ability to get the transportation they need, even if it's small pieces of what they want overall, and getting that feedback and deciding how things should work? And this kind of brings us to the idea of the power and dangers of metaphor, because oftentimes we talk about building software. And when we use words like building, it has a huge influence on how we think, because we take these physical experiences and use them to represent abstract ideas. If we tend to think of building, we tend to think of something where we have a complete plan up front and then we just build it, which doesn't really represent the way that software tends to be written, experimented with, and grows. I think if we think of software, we oftentimes think in terms of kind of carving it out of stone when we should be thinking more in terms of trying to sketch it. So in this case, you've probably seen the things where it's like, here's how you draw a horse. You draw a circle here in these lines, and then you keep filling it in, and the horse grows over time, even if the first lines that you started with were something like this. And something represented a horse but weren't really detailed. But by the time you get through, the original lines you drew have been erased or covered up. They don't even exist anymore. That type of approach is probably a lot better way to think about, a better metaphor for the way we build software than thinking of how the Sphinx was carved. And it's like, every time you chip something off, that's the way it's going to be for the next thousands and thousands of years. A useful way, I think, and kind of along with the idea of the roads, is we don't necessarily build roads. Although, I mean, I guess we say we do that, but roads tend to grow over time. Roads often started out as trails between 2 points and then grew into some type of mud road that let us take more equipment through them, then grew into some type of gravel road, then finally got paved, and then eventually uh, were replaced with a highway. It's things that changed over time, always focused on people need to get between 2 points. And I think the concept of cities work the same way, right? You may have some degree of planning, but if you look at cities over the past 200 years, think of New York or something like that, um, they have grown. They didn't start out with this plan of what it looks like today. They grew in response to change. Now they had lots of guide rails. They set aside Central Park and said, okay, we're not going to turn this into a business area. This is going to be set aside. And codes and different things like that. But there's subway systems that went places that they no longer need to go because that need is met better by something else. And that idea of growth, I think, is a very useful way for us to think about the way we move software. We grow in response to changes, and as we discover things, the software continues to evolve. Cities respond to change. We want to think of growing our software versus trying to build our software. Um, so actually, I'm going to skip over this one in interest of time, but let's take a look at this. So here we've got a hypothetical system, and we're going to categorize all the stories in this system based on like a yellow thing, capable of demonstration. So features that create a rough means of producing the desired result. Maybe that's something like just showing the logo on the page or something like that, right? We can't deploy it just the way it is, but it actually gives us something that lets us show stuff. Or maybe it's something where we need to create an account that's going to be this very complicated wizard, but we just throw all the fields on one page so we can create a simple account to be able to have it to do other things with and to demonstrate that we can create an account. So that might be capable of demonstration. Deployable to production means something that it might not be everything that we eventually want, but we could actually deploy this to production, right? It may not be fully ready to use, but we're going to limit it to just these people or just this one segment, and they could actually use it, but it's not everything we want. But we could actually take this all the way through to production. It's got all the security that it needs for it. Viable as a system of record would be stories that get us to the point where the bare minimum features to be able to run in place of the current system. So in this hypothetical system, we're replacing something that's out there. We've got, ye old software product, and we're replacing it with new and flashy software product and the green stuff gets us to that point where it meets the threshold of saying we're now at the point where we could shut off the old system. The new system is actually the thing keeping track of the data. Blue could be the other existing features. So things that we could go live without, but are really important because people are using them today, right? But if we didn't have them or didn't have them for a time, we could still go live. And then the dark blue or purple are enhancements that the current state doesn't have today. So if you look at the way a lot of systems are built, replacement systems are built, what I've seen happen is a lot of times we'll sequence something like this, and we'll start with those dark blue stories because those are the new features and those are the things everyone's really excited about that we're using to justify rebuilding the system. But when we do those first, so this represents the sequence through time, when we do those first, we defer the stories that are actually could be deployed to production or are viable as a system of record, right? We're working on other stuff. The dark blue stories are the things that we could actually go live without and be at parity with the current system. On the other hand, so in this case, we can't actually go live till we get over here and we finish that very last orange story. On the other hand, if we order it like this, we start out with things that are just capable of demonstration, and then we grow that. We're talking about growing systems. We grow to make it deployable to production, and then we grow to the point where we're viable as a system of record. And once we get through that, we may be able to go live. Now, maybe we want to wait and do some other things, but we're actually at the point where we say this is a system that we could go live with, even if we know we don't want to actually use it until we build some of these other things. And this introduces kind of this idea of the skateboard to a car. right? We start with things that are very simple, capable of demonstration. We can get feedback from. If somebody comes to you and says we need a transportation vehicle, we want a car, and they describe a car, and you say, okay, well, where do you want to go? Well, one of the places I want to go is down to the school at the end of my block. I want to do that. Well, giving them a skateboard that lets them start doing it's not everything they want, but that lets them start getting the transportation they need. And then they say, okay, well, the problem is I fall off the skateboard. And maybe you say, okay, well, we can turn it into a scooter. And then, well, I need to go further. So maybe we turn it into a bicycle. And then they need to get there faster. So we turn it into a motorcycle. And it keeps on growing. I think this metaphor gets misunderstood a lot of times. But the point is to make sure we're getting that feedback. They may find once they get to the motorcycle, they say that lets us get almost everywhere we want to go. But the next place we want to go is Hawaii. They discover the motorcycle actually gets them everywhere within the 30-mile radius they need to go. They discover it's very, very efficient. Their taxes and insurance are really low on it. So they're happy with that. But now they want to go into Hawaii. Well, if they're trying to get to Hawaii, building them a car is not going to help them, right? That doesn't get them what they actually need. But if you're giving them the ability to use stuff as they go, you can actually set them up for starting your return on investment early on from what you built for them, but also having those deep conversations of, what don't you like about what you have today? Well, the motorcycle does all this except for gets me to Hawaii. Well, that's a very different problem to solve than just starting with how do I build a car? So in the top thing, we've only got one option of when we can go live, which is when everything is done. This bottom thing gives us many options of when we can possibly go live. And this significantly reduces risk because if something takes longer, we can always say, okay, we're now at the point where we can go live. If the business and the users want to go live, we've now completed everything that we need to be viable as the system of record for this thing to go live. We're happy to wait as long as you want to go live, but we've mitigated the risk of not being able to go live. We can continue to build things as long as we want, but maybe we should go live and start letting people actually use it and then start building these other things on top of it. And what happens a lot of times is once you get a system into production and it's live, the priority of these things can dramatically change. And most systems I've been on that have done that, once they go live, it completely shifts the thinking of what we want next. Okay, so this is kind of a similar thing, right? We've got minimal and viable existing functionality and new features. The top represents doing it in kind of not a strategic way. The bottom represents ordering them, so we make sure we're working on the minimally viable things first before we work on replacing existing functionality that maybe isn't as important as the minimally viable, and then after that, start on the new features. Well, if we're working with user stories, if these all represent a user story, we may find that some of these can be split in two. So this represents the same thing, but if we find that we can split these stories in two, we may find that first story, only half of it is actually minimally viable, and half of it is actually existing functionality that we could go live without. An example of this is a project I was working on where they needed to have the holiday calendar built into the system. The existing system had a nice UI that you could go in and add new holidays as they came up for the year. That was very important. The system had to have something like that. So we had a story to make sure we replicated that functionality. But as we got to talking about, we discovered we could actually split that into two things. So like that very first thing there that we've got the yellow and the green, we thought it was all yellow at first, but when we talked about it, we discovered we could split it. And we needed to have a calendar in the system, but the UI to be able to actually change that calendar was something that we realized did not meet the threshold of being, or was not as important as the things that were minimally viable, because we could go live without it. And what they did is they ended up just saying, give us a spreadsheet with all the dates you want for the next year or year and a half. We'll load that into the system. And now it's not self-service for the non-develop. If we want to add another calendar, it's actually a deployment of or a database change. But this is a low-risk thing. We know how to load a spreadsheet into a database. So we're going to break that out and make the existing functionality of the UI portion of it something that we did later. And all those things. So if we do that, we now can shift this around, and maybe our point of where we could go live actually shifts sooner in time. We've lowered our risk by ordering things and splitting stories out. We also may find that some of these things, when we split them up, we can actually cancel them. Right? Maybe they don't need to be done. And so we put them at the very, very, very end, and maybe we just never get to them. But we've That's another way we can lower our risk with user stories. So let's look as an example here at uh, look at more building a piece of software from scratch that's not replacing an existing system. So Sam's Shoes is a hypothetical, very old, very prestigious shoe store. You can tell by looking at that tennis shoe that it's very old and prestigious tennis shoe. In some town where there's lots of very old money, and people's grandparents and great grandparents have always shopped at Sam's shoe store. And Sam is actually the descendant of the original Sam that started the shoe stores hundreds of years ago. And Sam is realizing that with the internet, he wants to stay in business, and he may need to change how he sells some. So you might start with a story like this: As Sam, I want to sell shoes online so I can make money. Well, if working software is the primary measure of progress, this story is going to take a really long time to do. So how can we actually deliver a piece of this without delivering all of it? Something that actually represents value to Sam. Now, granted, this story is actually better than some. I've seen some stories that look something like this. As a user, I want the system to work so I will be happy. I've actually seen people write things that almost look like that, as Dilberty as it sounds. Sometimes this isn't a good user story. This is not something that you can actually deliver on. Hopefully you can make them happy, but this doesn't make a good user story. So let's see. We try to refine it and say, as Sam, I want to sell shoes online so I can make money. Well, the why here, maybe this is a little bit better. But this particular story could encompass a huge number of things. It can encompass shopping cart, credit card processing, loyalty programs, customer login, saved addresses, inventory, recommendation engine, and probably 1,000 other things. And we assume here that we're building an e-commerce system instead of just using something off the shelf. So if we try to split this up, a way that a lot of people are going to kind of naturally try to split this up is say something like, as a developer, I want an API to the database so web services can query it. This isn't going to, this story doesn't mean anything to Sam. He may recognize that we do want to have a way to get to the database, but this story doesn't deliver value to him. It doesn't deliver value to his customer. And we've written it from the standpoint of what the developer wants instead of what the customer or the user wants. So how can we, but it's very important. So how can we actually do something toward this, but in a way that the customer can see as progress? So here's an example. As a customer, I want to see inventory so I can call to order. Now, this is not an e-commerce system, right? We're just saying we're going to show you what we've got in stock, because evidently we've got that existing in a system already, but we're going to show it to you online so you can say, oh, I want to go there. They've got the whatever old and established tennis shoe. They've got those shoes. I'm going to call and see if they can ship them to me. Or maybe I'm going to call and buy it and then go by and pick it up. So this is a very, very small story, but it still encompasses quite a bit of work, right? We need some way of deploying our software. We're going to have to buy the domain name if they don't have it already. We can probably defer on setting up SSL, although that could be part of this. We're going to have some way of getting an API from the website to the database. Maybe we find it's better to just push the database out to the website to get the inventory to start with. So we can end up with something like this, right? We've got Sam's shoes, we've got our super shoes, and the price, the duper shoes, and the super duper shoes. Like I said, these are very old and prestigious company that is selling top of the line shoes here that you will not find super shoes, duper shoes, or super duper shoes probably anywhere else. So we've got all these shoes, and now people can call. Well, what's the return on investment for this? Well, one thing, hopefully we've established some trust with Sam. We've showed that we can actually deliver something. We've also put them in a situation where they can actually get some orders now that they weren't able to get before from people going to the website. We can get metrics and see how many people are even willing to go to the website. Maybe there's something about buying shoes that no one would do it unless you can actually see it in person. It wasn't that many years ago when that was something we hadn't really, that was a possibility. You wouldn't, maybe if you wouldn't want to buy something if they'd seen it on a website, who knows. But we can also start proving out our assumptions of how well this aligns with Sam's market. And based on the information we get, it might impact how we build things. Moving on, we can get feedback on the design. Maybe we discover the design isn't old and prestigious enough, and we need to, as good as my graphic art skills are here, maybe it needs to be more heritage looking or whatever to match Sam's Shoes brand. And this example isn't is somewhat based on something that actually happened when Zappos was starting up. If you think about what do they need to start with, well, they need an e-commerce system and they need to have a warehouse with inventory, and there's all these things that they need to start. Well, they actually started with zero inventory. They went to Foot Locker and started taking pictures, bought shoes, put them into the took them back to their office, took nice pictures of them, took them back to Foot Locker, returned them. So they built up a lots of shoes that way, and then when people would buy them on their website, because they didn't know if people would buy them or not, they'd go back to Foot Locker, buy them, and send them to people. Now, that's not a good long-term business plan, but it was able to let them get started sooner and start getting feedback sooner than they could have if they had have decided they were going to wait to build lots of warehouses first. It turned out to be very, very successful, but that wasn't a given. They had to grow into that, and that's what our user stories should be doing. So if we think about the next story, well, the next story might be we'd want it to be the simplest next step. So what could that be? Well, maybe we say, as a customer, I want to order online so I don't have to call. That could be the next step here. Well, we could do that with very, very simple, to where each shoe has an order button next to it. And when you click the order, you type in your size, the name, the address, and the credit card, and place the order. I don't have a shopping cart. I don't remember anything. I've deferred maybe all the credit card stuff to something like Stripe, so I don't even have to deal with that. It's a very, very simple next step. And I've seen businesses start up that do things exactly like this. You can only order one thing at a time, but it sets them up to where they can start actually deliver something. They can deliver part of what they want before they deliver everything. Maybe another one says, as a customer, I want to add items to a cart so I can order multiple items. So maybe we've got something like this where you add it to the cart and then you can remove it from the cart, or you can place the order. And my goal isn't to show us how to design an e-commerce site, but what I want us to think about is how we could take incremental steps to doing things that provide the business with value, and hopefully help them start getting return on investment sooner, and help guide us in ways, guide us for what the next most important thing is. As a customer, I want to save my address so I don't have to re-enter it. So maybe that would be another thing. Maybe that becomes the most important thing. Or maybe there's something else. Maybe it's, I want to save my credit card. So these are all stories that could potentially be the next most important thing. We don't know what would be the next most important thing until we actually go ahead and build it and start getting customer feedback. So the question for you here is, at what point would you say that you actually have a new piece of software? If we're taking this change, do you have a new piece of software once the last line of original code has been replaced through a process of weekly changes? Is it when a new application is created and the old data is migrated over? Or is it both A and B, a new application? So I'm just curious for your opinion. There's no right or wrong answer here, but the point I want to make with this, let me throw it here in the chat here in case anybody doesn't have it. The point I want to make with this is that a software that's growing is going to look very, very different than something where it's just like, oh, we're going to take all the things we need to do and get to the end and be done. And user stories are a key part. Good user stories are a key part of how we actually create this type of growth, to where it's not even clear when the software has become something different, because we've got all these small things driven by delivering return on investment for the user and for the business. We've got all these small steps we're taking that it just becomes a continual evolution, rather than something where it's just all laid out and we plow through it regardless of what feedback we're getting. And this type of evolution is what good user stories help us accomplish. So let's see if we got a question. So can we have technical user stories that is directed towards development to actually do something, hence the how? Like I kind of mentioned, this is something you want to try to steer away from. And so as you significantly lower risk if you're able to think of your stories in terms of, if you've got something that's technically important, you talk to the user about something that would talk to the user, whoever's paying for the software and going to actually touch it, for here's the step we can take. It's important to us from a technical standpoint, but does this represent progress for you? And find some way to get that slice all the way through, instead of doing something technical that the user can't see as progress. And this can be difficult to do. Most of the teams I've seen, it's very possible to do, but it takes some work. But when you get a team that's used to thinking like this and used to having those back and forth with the business and with the users, they actually get really good at this type of thing. And the user will say, well, this is the next most important thing to me. The developers will say, okay, there's a piece of that that's going to require some technical work. What if we just do this slice of what you're asking for? Because then we have to touch these things we haven't had to touch before, or there's some risk around this, but let's make it really, really small, and deliver that part. And the business goes, yes, that sounds good, because the business is used to seeing things being delivered. They're used to seeing forward progress. And when you've established that trust with the business, it's a lot easier to maybe split something up in a way that they might not ask for, but is still something that they can see as being progress. But the trust of always seeing something that they see as progress is what gets you to the point where you can actually have those conversations and be productive with them. Okay, want to show, okay, if you I mentioned the URL. There's URL you are here. There's also youtube.com/markshed. That's where I put most of the agile cartoons. If you haven't seen those, you might enjoy those as well. And I think there's a link on these that you can get a PDF copy of my book, and also get on the invite list for this. If you're not on the invite list now, if you go to there and take a look at those cartoons, you can get into that. I should have put the URL in here, but I don't have it up right now. And final thing, I mentioned that one already. Oh, I didn't have any feedback on it. Okay. So thank you all for coming. I think we're at time here. I noticed we didn't get anything in the chat, so that was good feedback for me on how that works. If you enjoyed this, didn't enjoy it, like the other format better, like the time, but would rather it be on WebEx like we use, please hit reply to one of the invites or something, or send me an email. Let me know. I would love to hear how this worked, what you thought of it. This is my continuous improvement, so if I can get some feedback, I would love to have that. Also, don't forget, next week we are going to be talking about projects versus products, which actually fits very nicely with the things we've been talking about in user stories here. And the week after that, we're going to be looking at agile aligned organization. Like, how can an organization, not just at the team level, but at the organizational, align with agile? I know that's what a lot of scaling frameworks try to do. SAFe is trying to do this with varying levels of success, but we're going to talk about more of what are we trying to accomplish with organizational agility that may go beyond any particular framework being used for that. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Please do send me feedback. Let me know if this worked well with YouTube. If it didn't, if the time works better, I'd love to get some feedback on that. So thank you very much, and you all have a great day, and hope to see people Tuesday next week.